Alexander Sukhovo Kobylin was born on September 29, 1817. He was a Russian philosopher and playwright, chiefly known for his satirical plays criticizing Russian imperial bureaucracy. His sister Evgenia Tur was a popular novelist, critic, and journalist, and his sister Sophia was a painter of some note. Young Alexander had been a brilliant student at Moscow University, where he won a gold medal for a paper on the application of certain principles of physics to the construction of suspension bridges. After graduation, he studied philosophy in Heidelberg and Berlin, becoming, like many of his generation, a devotee of Hegel. In 1842, Sukhovo Kobylin enrolled in the Moscow civil service, rising to the rank of titular counselor, a position that he held at the time of his retirement from the administration in the summer of 1850. His role in the bureaucracy was more formal than active, a fact to which he proudly referred in suggesting that his tomb bear the inscription, "He never served." Sukhovo Kobylin's true calling was not government but business. Following the practical bent he had already shown in his university career, he organized wide-ranging enterprises, including forestry, livestock and horse breeding, textiles, sugar, vodka, and Russia's first champagne cellars. At the same time, he was a passionate sportsman, carrying off first prizes in horse races. Sukhovo Kobylin was a triumphant womanizer and an acid-tongued gossip. Everybody in Moscow high society knew about Sukhovo Kobylin's current romantic entanglements. According to his neighbor Alexander Mikhailovich Rembelinsky, he kept himself apart and did not enjoy much sympathy. His sister, the writer Evgenia Tur, characterized him as hot-blooded and uncontrollable. He showed no mercy to his servants who made mistakes and sometimes broke plates at dinner because of a dish he did not like. Since 1842, he had maintained an open liaison with Louise Simon Dimanche, a fashionable red-haired milliner whom he had met in Paris. Their meeting took place at a restaurant. When the young woman reported that she could not find work that suited her, Sukhovo Kobylin suggested that she move to Russia and gave her 1,000 francs for travel expenses. In the fall of 1842, the Parisian milliner came first to St. Petersburg and then to Moscow. Sukhovo Kobylin rented an apartment for her on Tverskaya Street, where she had the whole first floor to herself. He also provided servants for her from among his own serfs, as well as funds to open a wine shop and grocery store. His domineering mother, the cigar-smoking saloniste Maria Ivanovna, accepted Louise warmly and treated her like a trusted relative, but not quite a daughter-in-law. The couple's relationship survived periodic storms over Sukhovo Kobylin's chronic infidelities, never more scandalous than his current intrigue with a captivating married woman, Natalia Narishkina. Nadezhda Ivanovna Narishkina, at the time of her acquaintance with Sukhovo Kobylin, was married to Prince Alexander Grigorievich Narishkin. She was a high society lady who did not lack for suitors, though she was not considered a beauty. Contemporaries described her as a woman of small stature, reddish-haired, with irregular features. At the same time, she possessed a sort of peculiar grace, knew how to conduct conversations, and was very confident. In November 1850, Louise lived in the house of Count Gudovich in Tverskaya Street, renamed Gorky Street by the Soviets. Sukhovo Kobylin, early in the month, had vacated the principal rooms of his family's house at 9 Strasnoy Boulevard to make room for his sister and her husband, and moved into a wing of the same building. In the evening of November 7, 1850, Louise went out into the street and did not return home. The next morning, when Sukhovo Kobylin did not find her in the apartment, he organized a private search by sending a courier to a lady who knew Louise and visiting friends who might have known her whereabouts. The servants maintained that their master had never before been so alarmed about the absence of Dimanche. One annoyance Moscow police chief Luzhin particularly resented was having to talk business at his club. He was therefore far from pleased when fellow member Alexander Sukhovo Kobylin approached him in the late evening of November 8, 1850, to ask, in carefully guarded terms, whether the chief had received any news of a traffic mishap involving a woman in a blue cloak. Luzhin curtly said no, and returned his full attention to his cigar and brandy. In any event, he had never much liked Sukhovo Kobylin, though his family was beyond reproach. The 32-year-old man was the son of a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, Vasily Alexandrovich, who had lost an eye at Austerlitz and retired as a colonel in the artillery. The family proudly claimed common ancestry with the Romanovs. The police chief may have wondered momentarily about the identity of the mysterious woman in the blue cloak, but the next morning, November 9th, Sukhovo Kobylin visited Luzhin again and was more forthright in disclosing his worries. He now made an official request that the police search for Louise Simon Dimanche, who had disappeared 2 nights before. He indicated 2 possible directions for police inquiries: the Petersburg Chaussee to the northwest of the city, a highway that he had spent much of the day exploring himself without success, and the western road that led to the village of Choroshevo in the Silver Pine Forest. By the evening of November 9th, police efforts remained fruitless, but from an apparently independent quarter came the grim news of the discovery of a female corpse. Beyond the Presnensky Gate in the western perimeter of Moscow, the body, arms folded beneath, lay prone in a snow-covered ravine near the wall surrounding the Vagankovsky Cemetery. The beautiful woman, still young, was elegantly attired in a green check dress, blouse of Dutch linen, sky blue jacket, and veiled silk cap. She wore gold earrings set with brilliants, and rings adorned fingers of both hands. On her feet were velvet half boots, a strange choice for a wintry night's excursion. Beneath the woman's dress were 3 petticoats, but the corset that fashion mandated was absent. Her drawers were rucked up to the knees. When the police looked more closely at the woman, horror overwhelmed their admiration of her beauty. A loosened tress of her luxuriant red hair trailed around her neck, but failed to cover a yawning wound in her throat, from which some blood, but surprisingly little, had escaped to stain the snow. Near the corpse, there were tracks of a sleigh and horses' hooves. Everything seemed to proclaim that the body had been carried out of Moscow and deposited in fitting proximity to the cemetery, which lay not far from the Koroshevo road, which Sukhovo Kobylin had mentioned to the police chief. After the body was brought to Moscow, house serfs of Sukhovo Kobylin identified the dead woman as the missing Louise Simon Dimanche. Dr. Tikhomirov made an external examination of the body, followed on November 11th by an autopsy in which he participated. The body was of rather strong build and medium height. On the front of the neck, below the larynx, was a 5-inch diagonal wound, apparently inflicted with an even-edged instrument. The windpipe, carotid arteries, and both jugular veins were completely severed. A groove with the dimension of a little finger was noticeable all around the upper portion of the neck. The doctors also observed a large dark purple swelling, about the size of the palm of a hand, around the left eye. The entire left side of the body was bloody. On the left arm, from the shoulder to the elbow, was found a large dark stain with bruising and an obliquely indented groove ending in a triangular excoriation. 3 left ribs were fractured and another smashed. There was nothing pathological or abnormal found in the mouth, alimentary canal, or windpipe, and the internal organs showed no sign of bleeding and were otherwise in normal condition. Only in late January 1851 did the police make a detailed examination of the victim's clothing. The green dress was covered with thick streams of blood from the top to the waist. The first petticoat of white calico was also heavily stained, but there were barely noticeable stains on the exterior of the second petticoat and none closer to the body. The 2 doctors performing the autopsy concluded that the death of Louise Simon Dimanche was caused by extraordinary force resulting in the injuries they had observed, and especially by the unquestionably mortal wound at the front of the neck. The report of the murder spread rapidly through Moscow, and long before the police had a chance to complete an investigation, the public had confidently promulgated its own theory. Sukhovo Kobylin murdered his French mistress in a fury over her disruption of an amorous rendezvous with Natalia Narishkina. Simone Dimanche, the theory went, tracked her rival in the early hours of November 8th to the wing of Sukhovo Kobylin's house on Strasnoy Boulevard and surprised the 2 lovers when her presence was least needed. Angered at the intrusion and her abuse of Narishkina, Sukhovo Kobylin struck Louise with a candlestick and cut her throat. He then ordered his servants, whom Leonid Grossman hypothetically identifies as his valet Makar Lukyanov and cook Efim Igorov, to carry the body to the cemetery where it was found. The police were not as hasty as the public in pronouncing the case solved. Instead, they questioned a large array of witnesses, including Sukhovo Kobylin and his valet Lukyanov, and the house serfs he had delegated to serve Simon Dimanche in her apartment on Tverskaya Street. The assigned servants included 4 who were to be centrally involved in the investigation: 2 maids, Pelageya Alexieva, 15, and Agrafena Ivanova Kashkina, 27, the cook Igorov, who lived in Sukhovo Kobylin's house but worked in Louise's kitchen, and a boy from the wine shop, Galakshin Kozmin, who was serving as coachman at the time of the tragedy because of the illness of the regular driver. Incriminating evidence was found on Igorov's person when he was questioned. Under the lining of his vest pocket, he had concealed 100 rubles, a sum corresponding to Simon Dimanche's household funds. Later, police recovered Louise's gold watch in the attic occupied by Igorov in Sukhovo Kobylin's house. It was wrapped in a letter addressed to the valet Lukyanov. The police placed Igorov, Lukyanov, and Louise's 3 other household servants under arrest. From depositions of the young substitute coachman Kozmin and other witnesses, the police were able to reconstruct many of the details of Louise's busy last day. Her schedule did not suggest that she was a woman brooding about her lover's infidelity or plotting a melodramatic intervention. Kozmin had driven the Frenchwoman around Moscow on a 12-hour excursion beginning at 9 a.m. The first stop was at Gazetny Lane to pick up Louise's close friend, Madame Ernestine Leandert, with whom she proceeded to Ochotny Row, renamed Mark's Prospect, to shop for provisions. Louise spent an hour chatting at Ernestine's apartment and afterwards returned home alone for about an hour. Then she was back in her sleigh, ordering Kozmin to drive her successively to a bookstore, a business office, and her dressmaker's. Stopping at home to change for the evening, she was off again for dinner at Ernestine's with her friend's lover, Lieutenant Sushkov, and another tall man with a mustache whom Kozmin didn't know. Then the 4 left in a pair of sleighs for an evening's ride around the boulevards, ending with a drive across the Kuznetsky Bridge to eat ices at a popular confectioner's shop. When Kozmin brought her home at 9 p.m., Louise ordered that the horse, understandably tired, be unharnessed. Much of Louise's next hour, the last time she was seen before the murder, was devoted to household matters. Efim Igorov told the police that he had come to see her around 10 p.m. to ask her what food to prepare for the following day. When he left Dimanche's place, she gave him a note for his master, which he delivered to the valet because Sukhovo Kobylin was away. After Igorov's departure, a clerk, Fyodor Fedotov, arrived with expense accounts for the table, and Dimanche ordered him to tell his master to send an answer to the note she had dispatched to him through the cook Efim. But Fedotov did not give the message to his master because he didn't see him. When he returned from Dimanche's, his master wasn't at home. Although Louise's note was sealed, the valet Lukyanov stated that she had written to inquire whether Sukovo Kobilan planned to dine with her on the following evening, November 8th. According to Lukyanov, his master, on his return home early in the morning of November 8th, told him to inform Simon Dimanche that he had an engagement for the evening, so that only breakfast should be prepared for him. The housemaid Pelageya Alexieva stated that, after sending her letter to Sukhovo Kobylin, Simon Dimanche waited about a half hour for a response. Then the other maid, Agrafena Kashkina, saw her mistress leave the apartment, wearing a warm cloak and the same apparel in which she had been dressed for the evening. Louise did not tell any of her servants where she was going. She said only that she would soon return and did not even order them to extinguish the candles. Alexieva added that, about 8 a.m. the next morning, a tall gentleman with a small mustache called and introduced himself as a friend of Madame Ernestine. He asked after Simone Dimanche, and, when the maids told him she had not yet come home, he said, "That's a bad business." Only after the stranger left did Sukhovo Kobylin arrive to find that Louise was missing. On November 16th, Moscow society, despite its own suspicions, was shocked by the news that Sukhovo Kobylin had also been placed under arrest. Police cited inconsistencies in his statements. The smooth-talking aristocrat was convinced that robbery must have been the motive and that the murderer was likely either an unidentified hackney coachman, whom Louise had engaged for her mysterious nocturnal errand, or Efim Igorov, who had been found in possession of her money and watch. But if it was robbery that had inspired the crime, why had the killer overlooked the jewelry with which the ears and fingers of the corpse were adorned? The Muscovite gossips had a ready explanation. Sukhovo Kobylin's accomplice, through stupidity or haste, had neglected to support the robbery red herring by removing the jewelry. Sukhovo Kobylin stoutly asserted an alibi for the murder night. He had been a dinner guest of the Narishkins and returned home very late. Some of the Narishkin servants supported the story, but the police strangely failed to question either the Narishkins or their other guests. It was not only on Sukhovo Kobylin's depositions that the police based their arrest warrant, but also on discoveries made in the search of the wing he had recently begun to occupy at the family house on Strasnoy Boulevard. The finds that the police trumpeted were a letter to Simon Dimanche, which they believed established Sukhovo Kobylin's premeditation of the crime, a pair of daggers, and a number of apparent bloodstains. By contrast with these intriguing clues, searches of Simon Dimanche's apartment on Tverskaya Street revealed no signs of violence, and neither Prince Radziwill, a student who lodged in a flat above, nor any of the servants in the house had heard any outcries or other suspicious sounds on the night of the crime. The evidence that the police identified in Sukhovo Kobylin's rooms was a remarkably weak foundation for a murder charge against him. The supposedly incriminating letter that the arrested man had sent to Louise was written in a playful tone. Chère maman, it happens that I will stay for several days in Moscow, knowing that you have remained in the countryside only to play out your farces and to listen to a passion that, alas, doesn't tell you my name, but that of another. I prefer to call you back to my side so as to have an ungrateful and treacherous woman in my sight and within reach of my Castilian dagger. Return and... The investigators were not expert in the literary analysis of love letters, nor were they able to elucidate such an obvious phallic symbol as a Castilian dagger. Instead, the police seized two ornamental daggers as possible instruments of the crime. Clearly, the police felt more at home with bloodstains, and they thought they had found quite a few at Strasnoy Boulevard, but by no means in the copious amount they should have expected to encounter if the throat of a living woman had been cut in the apartment. Still, they carefully catalogued what they had observed. On the wall plaster of a variously described antechamber, in the direction of the hallway, two small stains appeared, one in the shape of a spreading oblong drop about 2 inches long, and the other a spatter of the size of a 5-kopeck silver piece. In the hall near a storeroom, a 7-inch semicircular spot could be seen on the dirty floor near the baseboard, and nearby blood-colored streams and splotches, partly cleaned. Apparent bloodstains of various sizes were also visible on the back stairs. Floors in all the rooms were painted yellow and recently washed. Sukhovo Kobylin found innocent explanations for all these stains. Many people had lived in the wing before him, and he had only recently moved there. He had not yet had occasion to give attention to cleaning or refurbishing his rooms. He told the police that poultry and game from the country were often brought up the back stairs for slaughtering there, and in the hallway, where a slop bucket was kept to catch the blood. He was less certain of the origin of the wall stains, but he recalled that one of his manservants was inclined to nosebleeds. In view of Sukhovo Kobylin's admittedly violent treatment of his serfs, it was small wonder. The police cut away pieces of the wall plaster and floor, for some reason neglecting to sample the stains on the back stairs, and submitted the evidence for forensic analysis. The Moscow Medical Office ruled that the stains on the floor were dried blood, but that the determination whether it was of human or animal origin was beyond available scientific means. Its appraisal of the wall stains was even less conclusive. Because of the insignificant size of the sample and the impossibility of separating the stain from the plaster without substantial admixture, the composition of the stains could not be determined. On November 20th, the case took a dramatic turn when the cook Igorov, after being sequestered for intensive questioning, confessed to the murder with the participation of Simon Dimanche's 3 other servants, who in order confirmed his story in all significant particulars. The servants' motive was revenge for their mistress's cruel treatment, and the theft of the household funds and other valuable objects not kept under lock and key was pretty much an afterthought. One of the main sources of the servants' miseries with their late employer was that Louise had never acquired a sure command of the Russian language. Often the serfs did not fully understand her oral instructions, and when as a consequence they did not perform to her satisfaction, she beat them or denounced them to Sukhovo Kobylin, who had a much heavier hand. When Igorov entered her household, he already had a personal grievance against Louise. His sister Vasilisa had previously served her as chambermaid and left after only 3 months because of her tyranny. In his confession, as supplemented by the statements of his confederates, Igorov said that in the days before her death, Simon Dimanche had become even nastier and more capricious, and he often talked with the other servants about getting rid of her. About 8 p.m. on November 7th, he came to Tverskia Street to obtain his mistress's instructions about food. She wasn't home yet, so he sat with the maids and they renewed their conversation about how to finish the business they had been discussing. They decided to kill her early the next morning, and he instructed them to pass the word to Kosmin when he came back. He was about to leave when the sleigh returned, so he sought out the young driver in the stable, where he was putting away the horse, and announced the murder plan directly. Having made his arrangements for the crime, Igorov calmly presented himself to Simon Dimanche to discuss his cooking duties. When he arrived home at Strasnoy Boulevard later that evening, he gave Simon Dimanche's note to the valet Lukyanov and went to sleep in the servants' quarters. At 1:30 in the morning, Lukyanov woke him up with their master's response. Igorov was to tell Simon Dimanche to prepare only breakfast, for His Excellency would be busy for dinner. Igorov had quite a different errand in mind. He went back to the Tverskaya Street apartment at about 2 a.m. and aroused his accomplices. Kosmin took a flat iron from the kitchen, and the two men proceeded to Louise's bedroom door, which the maids by prearrangement had kept unlocked. Their mistress was sleeping. Igorov, walking right up to the bed, pressed a pillow over her face. When she woke up and cried out twice, Igorov gagged her with a handkerchief, seized her throat, and began to strangle her, using a towel as a noose. He struck her once with his fist in her left eye, and Kosmin meantime beat her sides with the flat iron. When the woman was dead, the maids dressed her. Kosmin harnessed the horse and the two men, unobserved, placed the body downward in the sleigh under a fur cover. When they arrived at the cemetery, Igorov, in sudden panic, thought he heard Simon Dimanche utter a feeble sound, so he cut her throat with Kosmin's folding knife and threw the weapon somewhere nearby. While the men were disposing of the body, the two housemaids put the murdered woman's apartment in order. When Igorov and Kosmin returned from the cemetery, the maids burned Louise's cloak in a Dutch oven. Kosmin located 2 bottles of wine in the back room and drank with Igorov until 6 o'clock in the morning, when they capped their revels with a visit to a local tavern. After Igorov's confession, Sukhovo Kobylin was released, but the investigation of his complicity lumbered on in spite of the disappointing results of the bloodstain analysis. On December 8, 1850, Natalia Narishkina, pregnant with Sukhovo Kobylin's child, obtained permission to leave for France, where she later became the mistress and then wife of Alexandre Dumas Fils. The authorities' apparent belief in Narishkina's innocence was not shared by Leo Tolstoy, who on December 7th wrote to his relative Tatyana Ergolskaya a garbled account of the case. Since you are keen on tragic stories, I'll tell you one which has created a stir in Moscow. A certain Mr. Kobylin was keeping a certain Madame Simon, and he supplied her the services of 2 men and a maidservant. Now Mr. Kobylin, before Masiki's keeping this Madame Simon, formed a liaison with Madame Narishkina, née Knorring, a lady from the best Moscow society and a lady very much in vogue, and he had not stopped corresponding with her, although he was keeping Madame Simon. On top of all this, one fine morning, Simon is found murdered, and certain evidence indicates that she was killed by her own servants. This might not have amounted to anything much, were it not for the fact that the police, when arresting Kobylin, found among his papers some letters from Madame Narishkina, in which she reproaches him for abandoning her and threatens Madame Simon, which only adds to the many other reasons for concluding that the murderers were but the instruments of Madame Narishkina. On September 13, 1850, the Moscow Aulic Court, Nadvorny Sud, rendering the first judgment in the case, convicted the 4 servants and declared Sukhovo Kobylin not guilty. Igorov, Kosmin, and the 2 maids were sentenced to deprivation of all civil rights, public flogging, together with branding for the men, and hard labor in prison, mine, or workhouse for terms ranging from 22.5 to 15 years. Though Igorov was identified as the ringleader and sent to a prison camp, Kashkina drew the longest sentence. The judgment was affirmed by the Moscow Criminal Tribunal, Ugolovnaya Palata. Despite the outward appearance that the trial proceedings were being resolved in Sukovo Kobilan's favor, the case against the servants was in fact beginning to unravel. In May and June 1851, the two maids recanted their confessions, claiming that their depositions had been manufactured by their interrogators. In connection with their appeals to the Senate, Igorov and Kozmin followed suit. The cook claimed that his confession had been coerced by torture, and both men claimed that the police had held out enticements in the form of letters from Sukhovo Kobylin offering rewards and freedom for them and their families. In December 1852, a Senate hearing upheld the criminal tribunal's decision regarding Sukhovo Kobylin, though Senator Chutyaintsev dissented, believing in Sukhovo Kobylin's probable guilt. The case was referred to Minister of Justice Fo N. Panin, who criticized the investigation's shortcomings and rejected the motive of robbery. He noted Sukhovo Kobilin's suspicious behavior after the murder and called for a thorough reinvestigation. Despite further questioning of servants and re-examination of evidence, the new inquiry yielded no conclusive results. The Moscow Criminal Tribunal reaffirmed Sukhovo Kobylin's innocence, but the Senate found his involvement still suspect while exiling the servants for perjury. Ultimately, Sukhovo Kobylin's mother successfully petitioned the Empress to intervene in behalf of her son, who was now running the risk of becoming an eternal suspect. Even with imperial favor, the path to freedom was far from smooth. It was only on October 25, 1857, however, that the State Council, after previous maneuvering in the Senate, approved a judgment freeing the serfs from responsibility for the murder and entrusting them to the protection of local authorities against any reprisals from their master, and relieving Sukhovo Kobylin as well from the murder charge, but ordering him for his illicit love affair to submit himself to ecclesiastical penitence for the cleansing of his conscience. The Tsar approved the decree on December 3, 1857, finally bringing Sukhovo Kobylin's travail to an end. In 1936, a powerful rebuttal was made by Victor Grossman in the case of Sukhovo Kobylin, Urdello Sukhovo Kobylina. Victor Grossman believes that Louise Simon Dimanche was murdered by the servants substantially in the manner detailed by them in their confessions, and that Sukhovo Kobylin was innocent of the crime. He notes that violent reprisals of Russian serfs against their abusive masters were common and argues that the sole purpose of Sukhovo Kobylin's prosecution was to extort bribes, which he regards as the very life's blood of the Tsarist court system. In the course of his researches, Victor Grossman submitted the evidence to a forensic scientist, Professor N.V. Popov. The professor concluded that Louise had died of strangulation, probably by a towel, as evidenced by the wide furrow in her upper neck, and that the injuries to her body were consistent with having been inflicted by an angular blunt instrument, such as a flat iron. The lack of bleeding in the windpipe and esophagus was strong proof that Louise's throat had been slit after she was dead, and the blood found on the snow at the cemetery was consistent with the post-mortem throat cutting confessed by Igorov, which in Popov's view would have resulted in some blood flow, perhaps facilitated by the constriction of blood vessels due to the cold weather. Popov rejected the evidence of the so-called bloodstains in Sukhovo Kobylin's apartment as unreliable and opined that had the victim's throat been cut there, while she was alive, blood would have spurted over a much greater area. Victor Grossman also scored heavily against Leonid Grossman's theory that Louise had voluntarily left her apartment late at night without changing any of her dinner apparel. She would never have gone to dinner with two gentlemen without wearing a corset, and her velvet half-boots were not appropriate for a winter sleigh ride. The maids must therefore have dressed her dead body, but they did not struggle to put on her corset and left her drawers unfastened. Finally, there was no evidence that Sukhovo Kobylin, despite his new infatuation with Narishkina, had lost his regard for Simon Dimanche, who in any event had told friends she would soon be leaving for France, with a pension promised by her lover. After her departure from Russia, Narishkina bore Sukhovo Kobylin a daughter whom he named Louise after his murdered mistress and cherished during his entire lifetime. Over his bed, he hung a portrait of Simon Dimanche and proudly pointed it out to visitors.